you say, my contribution will be to, for example, bring these, this analytical framework into a new area, for example, if you're doing historical research, or if you're doing ethnographic research, or any kind of empirical research, you're extending something. So I'm going to extend it, and this audience is going to recognize this. And so you're going to have almost automatically, I think, a vocabulary that's quite ordinary and not saturated with theoretical and conceptual baggage. You're just going to have possibly an ordinary way to say it. And that's how you're going to get the grant, right? Because the grant writers may not be familiar with your theoretical framework. So bogging it all down in trying to show them how smart you are and how much theory you know is a really bad strategy, say, for writing a grant. You have to, so imagining your audience lets you just say it. And then, you know, my mantra is show, don't tell. Show, don't tell, show, don't tell. I say this all the time to my graduate students. You're showing your audience something, you're not telling them something. How are you going to do that? That's your method. How are you going to show? And so that, when I figured that out, that was really kind of like an epiphany for me, and a really important, almost revelatory moment, when I figured out that by saying that I was showing rather than telling, that I was actually articulating my method. And that was good enough, that was a good enough way to articulate the method. So your contribution is what will be persuasive to whatever audience that you've chosen. And it'll be the thing that either surprises them or makes them see things differently than they do already, which means, of course, that you have to really know a lot about what your audience knows. And, you know, that's, again, you know, part of that method section that Sumru was mentioning, how hard that is. Right, that's your method section. What does my audience know? And I'm going to show them something that they don't already know. That's a contribution. It's not changing the world. It's not, you know, convincing everybody. It's, you know, it's just to dampen down the expectations. So it might be evidence that you will find. It might be an argument that you'll make to support your analytical framework that makes it possible to see things the way that you do. Whatever. There are countless possibilities for a contribution. And it really is a vast area. It doesn't have to look only one way. So when you're writing for different audiences, which is inevitable if you're doing interdisciplinary research, how do you balance that? And this is a really very difficult thing, I think, to do, especially if you have high aspirations to write that big crossover book that's going to be used in undergraduate courses and get a general audience, and the activists you're working with are going to be able to read it, and your dissertation chair is going to be blown away by the theoretical contribution, and you're going to get it published by a major university press, and you're swimming in all these competing audiences, and it's a really, really very difficult thing to do to hit more than one audience at a time. So how do you write for different audiences? I think the best way to do that is to state that in your research. You state that in your proposal, you state that in the introduction maybe of the dissertation. This book is trying to reach these different audiences, and will be able to do so if you show rather than tell your audience what you think, what you found, what your theoretical framework is. Show rather than tell. You've just hit more than one audience. And I think that's why books that were really important to me to help me figure this out were things like Donna Haraway's Primate Visions, for example. You know, she did something quite extraordinary. She wrote a book that was read in science studies, obviously, in feminist theory, and political theory, and it's read all over the map. How did she reach so many audiences? Because each of her chapters is a story, or a story about stories, and it doesn't resolve those, it doesn't tell you what the true story is. It shows you what you get when you look at the, you know, sort of the rub between two different or three different or four different stories. And so that's that's a great way to conceptualize it. It might not work if you're in a very traditional department. It might not work to do that if you don't want to say, I'm a storyteller, I'm going to tell stories. But just call it theory, call it whatever you're supposed to call it, and nobody cares about that. So showing rather than telling. And be clear about how your chosen audience will shape the boundaries, the scope, and even the depth of your research. Like you could keep going down, for example, in a case forever. When is enough enough? It's when you can communicate it to your audience, then that's enough. That's all you need. So there's an end point. So and then avoid here's my contribution to this body of literature. So and so says this, so and so says that, and I say this. 2/3 of that no audience cares about. No audience in the world cares about the first 2/3 of that, unless you're doing that, that kind of looking at your own field and how can we be self-reflexive. And if you're writing that kind of stuff, you do need to do that, and it is important, and it does have a place. But if you're trying to make a theoretical contribution, I think, on the back of empirical, ethnographic, historical research, that 2/3 of stuff has to all be relegated to the footnotes. It has to get out of there because it's boring, and it's rehearsing stuff people either already know or don't care about, and so get it out of there. And then that 1/3 is what you have to say. Use that to tell those stories, because it takes a long time. It takes a lot of pages, and let that speak instead of the body of literature or whatever. So the most important part of research design is stating the problem or the question that your research will address clearly. I mean, this is the hardest thing in the world to do. It sounds so simple. Okay. And it should simply be something that has the effect that, your friend that you meet at the cafe, or when you call your mom, they say, oh, that's interesting. And as soon as you get that effect, you got it. That's what you're after. So then in conducting research, you really are the conductor. And so when you're conducting research, it's going to be like a perpetual authority crisis, right? So you're the author of this. You are the authority. And it's, at least for me, doing my dissertation, I was in a perpetual state of authority crisis as an author. Who am I to say? I've got to cite Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Marx, etc. I've got to cite all this stuff. I've got to cite all these smart people in my field that have written about those things. And I'm going to do all that and put all that in front, but I still haven't established my authority. So where does that come from? Where does my authority come from? It's a real struggle, I think, and I don't have an easy answer to that. But again, I believe that if you think about, looking at a case, you now know a lot about this really interesting case, and other people don't know about it. So imagine your audience as the people who don't know about the case that you're about to tell them about, and tell them. And I mean, that's not perfect, because you're still going to have an authority crisis, I promise you. It will happen. It's not going to go away. But those are some of the things I say all the time to my grad students. So thank you.
So during the breakout sessions, Professor Cruikshanks will be in room 5318, which is the ARC conference room.
Can I make a quick announcement? We're gonna guide. We won't be able to guide people to these rooms because there will be lunch in between. So you can find the program there on the table, and the rooms are also in the program.
Also, do you want to take these?
Yes.
Thanks. So next up we have Professor David Garland. He is the Arthur T. Vanderbilt Professor of Law and Professor of Sociology. sociology at New York University. Born and raised in Scotland, he graduated from the University of Edinburgh and taught there from 1979 to 97 before moving to the US. He is the author of several award-winning books on punishment and criminal justice, including Punishment and Modern Society, The Culture of Control and Peculiar Institutions, America's Death Penalty in an Age of Abolition. He has also edited the volume Mass Imprisonment, Social Cause and Consequences, and his most recent book, The Welfare State, A Short Introduction, was published by Oxford University Press in June of this year. So, thank you and welcome.
Thanks very much indeed. So, I feel like the last person who wants to be giving advice to researchers, graduate students starting out, because I myself feel very badly trained for what it is I do. I certainly don't feel like I have a recipe or a formula I can easily impart. The work I do is really kind of historical sociology, focused mostly on law, criminal justice, recently welfare state institutions. But the way I came to that is through an education in Britain, which was originally, my first degree was a law degree, undergraduate law degree. Then I did a criminology master's degree. Then I did a PhD. Social legal studies was its description, but it was a British-style PhD, which meant there was no training, effectively. You were kind of like left to your own devices by, in my case, a supervisor who himself didn't have a PhD. So I feel singularly untrained and completely autodidact, and whatever I know by having, as it were, acquired it on the job. And so anyone who knows any of the things I've written would never regard me as being a sophisticated methodologist or somebody who has a methodology that I can present. And I don't actually think of myself as a theorist either. In my sociology job, I teach classical social theory, sometimes contemporary theory. I tend to read theory. But to the extent that theory features in my work, it always features eclectically and pragmatically. That's to say, I draw on various theoretical frameworks or traditions or conceptual frames in order to try and solve certain problems or explain certain things. And the theoretical ideas and the conceptual grids that I found useful change depending on the problem that I'm trying to resolve. And at various times that's been, the work of Durkheim or Geertz or Foucault or Elias or Bourdieu. But the question is really for me not kind of what's the theoretical framework I'm using, it's what's the problem I'm trying to explain or to unpuzzle. And really what I want to emphasize, I thought Barbara's description very helpful indeed. I'm kind of writing down notes what they were saying. I guess it's not too late for me to get trained, but what I want to focus on is what I regard as the most important feature of doing research, which is to say posing the question, identifying a problem, figuring out what it is that you're trying to interpret or to explain, and that thing being selected in a way that, first of all, is capable, given your capacities and resources and time, capable of being explained, but also interesting enough because it reflects and resonates with larger questions. So being able to pose concrete, specific problems about specific practices or developments or events in a way that makes it manageable and doable, but in a way that speaks to larger things, so that in the end you're not becoming a specialist in something nobody's interested in, but nor are you trying to address general questions that you're hardly in a position to add much to, given that they're general and everyone's talking about them and there's nothing very much new under the sun to be said. So that's sort of the emphasis. I myself have succeeded over time in formulating some good questions and answering them in ways that other people found useful. more of my time spent not succeeding in doing that. And if I were to depend for a living on writing successful grant proposals and being funded, I think I'd be completely on the streets, because the knowing in advance what I'm doing is not my experience. But basically, I work hard, and there are things I'm interested in, and I'm reading and studying all the time, but only occasionally does this work formulate itself into a doable, exciting project that I kind of know now I have something to say. So I mean, right now, for example, I'm reading lots of materials, and I have lots of half-formulated thoughts, which sometimes in the morning seem like, crystallized and clear, and by the afternoon seem like, they're just vague and it's not going anywhere. And so the experience of being at sea is, I think, quite an important one, and one that you have to kind of embrace and confess to, because it's really been my experience as a researcher that it's not, you're not marching from one thing to the next. Even if from a distance, if you are relatively productive and manage to, in the end, resolve these problems and do some work, it might look like you know what you're doing. My experience is I never have known what I was doing until after I've done some of it, much of it. If people sort of say, what are you working on? I really like to tell them until I really have done, half of the book or half of the article, and I really think there is something there, because at the beginning, who knows? I have more failed projects that resulted in nothing, except maybe, learning from that mistake and reworking it later on, than I have actual projects. And I think that people should realize that that's the uncertainty and security and kind of excitement and creativity that comes with being a researcher, being a scholar. I was teaching the other day Robert K. Merton's work to sociology doctoral students, and then one of the things that really struck me is he at one stage, I think the person that wrote the introduction to one of his books of essays, formulates about 14 different tasks for theory, 14 different things that theory does. I even have a printout of it somewhere, but you'd be surprised there's so many, right? But they include conceptual clarification, construction, middle-range generalization, functional analysis, structural analysis, construction of typologies, paradigms, formalization, specification of ignorance, productive return to the classics. But the first task for theory is problem finding. And he just talked about problem finding, defining, he says, scientific questions, finding rationales for these questions, and specifying what might be done to answer them. And it seems to me that's exactly right. And that typically involves, all of this involves knowing a lot, reading a lot, being, the graduate training of doing courses in specific subdisciplines and areas and topics, allowing you to, as it were, know what's known and know what the current research questions are and what specify ignorance is another task for theory. Things that are still not known but might be. That seems very important to me. And writing history of the present, which is one of the kind of projects mentioned there. And if I were to think of the kind of work I do most of the time, that is some version of trying to write critical accounts of present-day phenomena that I find problematic and if not unintelligible or inexplicable, then at least puzzling and problematic. And the notion of history of the present is that some or other a genealogy and account of the conditions of emergence of that particular phenomenon will help illuminate how it works and why it's misunderstood in its workings, because to some extent it's a product of previous conflicts and struggles that are no longer so foreign to us. But in that history of the present, you have to begin by diagnosing the present. You have to begin by identifying something problematic about it, something puzzling about it, something difficult about it. And in much of my, not all of my work, but some of my work, that's sort of been what I've tried to do. Anomalies, paradoxes, surprising variation or transformation. These are the kinds of things that are clues to puzzles, clues to explanatory challenges that one can rise to. The other thing that's very important I found in my own work, and I encourage graduate students to do this, is to to avoid, in the end, the only kind of work that gets done is important is specialist work, focused on a particular topic, knowledgeable and deep on that topic. But it's important not to just be a specialist. It's important to have a range. It's important to read in areas that are not your own or your only focus. It's important to be able to draw on the material from one body of work and think about other bodies of work using it. So for example, my own experience, the first book I wrote, my PhD dissertation, book called Punishment and Welfare. Basically what happened was I was in a criminology master's course, and I was interested, even though the course wasn't especially, in Marxist theory and in Marxist accounts of the state, and particularly the development of monopoly capital and the emergence of a new kind of state form, the welfare state, total democratic state. And that was sort of what I was reading, as it were, offline. And in my classes, I was doing something else. And I remember having a conversation with Sir Tony Bottoms, or Anthony Bottoms, as you know, is Tony Bottoms, my advisor. And he was saying, look, you know, there were all these sudden developments in criminal justice in the first decade of the 20th century, like the invented probation and reformatory institutions and prison classification and controls of the feeble-minded and the elite. It all happened in about 3 or 4 years. I wonder what that was about. And of course, none of the Marxist theories of the state were interested in the least in any of that, what it was about. No one in the criminal justice historians particularly interested in Marxist theories of the state and development of class relations and the transformation of capital and working class in the 1890s and 1900s. But it seemed to me that, you know, these two things might not be unrelated, if only in time. And so the work I did on that dissertation and eventually the book was very much bringing, you know, large-scale, general, structural accounts of social change and changes in government to bear on very specific developments in criminal justice and crime control, details of which I understood and knew, and the theory that I was bringing to bear on it was new to it. It happened about the same time. This was 1978, 79, I was just getting started this. I was reading Michel Foucault's work, Discipline and Punish. And although Discipline and Punish was about a different, or identified a different time period, really the Foucault suggests that transformation of this kind took place in the 1780s and 1820s. I was finding that to the extent these kind of transformations Foucault was describing took place, they took place a very long time later in a very much more modified way, and could be shown to have, as it were, a distortion patterns of success and failure and modification. So I ended up writing a kind of Foucauldian Marxist account of criminal justice change at the beginning of the 20th century. And purely because I was interested in one thing and reading about something else, and I saw a connection, a possibility of connecting the same things. Many years later, 15 years later, 16 years later, I wrote a different book, Culture of Control, which was about the puzzle of why the pattern of kind of penal welfare, rehabilitative, correctional, criminal justice and crime control, which had been established in the 1890s in the USA and the UK, pretty much in the Western world. Why, in ways that no criminologists had predicted, were most of these frameworks and ideas and practices suddenly reversing themselves and suddenly being undone or suddenly being modified in quite serious ways. And at the time, most of my colleagues who were, this was in the 1990s, were kind of aware of this set of developments. You know, now we think of it as the kind of run-up of law and order or mass incarceration or culture of control or punitive return or something. But they were mostly kind of pointing to the political sources of this and you know, arguing against it, because of course they and I were formed in the penal welfare correctional world that was now being challenged and undone. And I remember someone saying to me, you know, what do you think is going on? I said, well, I really don't know. I haven't studied it. I mean, I know what's happening on a daily basis. I know what the headlines are. I know, but I really have no basis for understanding what's actually happening. And so the culture of control ended up being an attempt to study these myriad developments in policing and prosecution and victims in punishment, in prisons, in crime control, in private security, in the social organization of secure spaces. And I try to analyze that, and I try to analyze everything I do in a kind of dispassionate way. It didn't begin by knowing who the enemies were and it was all their fault, but began by asking the question of what's happening. And that's a descriptive sociology question, that's establishing the phenomenon. And that I think is a very important first step, because by and large, as a researcher, you do most of your theoretical work when you describe in detail what the problem is. Because actually a closely specified account of what the question is and its characteristics and its institutional social and cultural ramifications, that work of description is more and more excluding possible explanations. The more specific you are in identifying the phenomenon, the fewer possible accounts could explain it. So description and explanation are kind of interlocked in that kind of way. So beginning by describing the phenomenon, the other thing is I myself, and not everyone agrees with this or approves of this, I try very hard to take a kind of Weberian dispassionate stance with respect to the material that I'm dealing with. That's not always so easy, and of course it's never entirely possible. You can't, as it were, undo all of your prejudices and priorities and values and pattern perceptions, but you can succeed in controlling for and being conscious of one's own wishful thinking and one's own preferred view of the world. And I think it's very important to do that. So final example, I've got a couple of minutes left. I did a book about the death penalty, or rather a book about the American system of capital punishment that tried not to say it's a good thing or a bad thing, but tried to explain the rather anomalous practice of the death penalty in the USA at a time when comparable nations in the Western world had abolished it, in the places where it still existed, which was to say just a few places really, and in the forms that it took, which is to say really bizarre, elaborated legal and cultural and political set of lengthy contested practices, resulting in occasionally some 30 or 40 of the 40,000 homicide convictions resulting in somebody put to death. And my whole approach to studying that was to try to do it in a non-normative way. That's to say, the only values that I mobilized were the values of, as it were, Weberian social science, rather than I'm against the death penalty and should say so. And my own kind of conceit is that kind of dispassionate analysis is capable of doing more normative work in the end than the normatively committed, value committed analyses that standardly are used in it. And the reason I say that is this, that I think that to evaluate something, to assess its moral status, you have to know what that thing is, and you have to understand how it works. And people who, as it were, are asked, do you approve the death penalty, yes or no, is the death penalty good? They should say, I'm not able to answer that. The question is, what kind of death penalty is it we're talking about? What's the practice? What does it look like? And does it work or not work? Well, what are you trying to do? And I felt that the dispassionate approach, particularly to highly emotive, heavily normative, contested topics, is actually, again, one of the things that sociologists and historians can bring to the world. And we ought not to disparage it in order to be committed in our political and scholarly research. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
So Professor Garland will be in 5200 in the political science thesis room. So I am going to ask our panel, so because we started a little late, we kind of moved through our break time. We're tentatively scheduled to stop at noon for lunch, but we have some flexibility. So I was going to ask if you would prefer to have a 5-minute break now and then continue, or just keep going until.
I say carry on.
Excellent. So next we have Professor Mary Hawksworth, Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. Her teaching and research interests include feminist theory, women in politics, contemporary political philosophy, philosophy of science, and social policy. Her major works include embodied power, demystifying disembodied politics, the Oxford Handbook of Feminist Theory, Gender and Power Towards Equality and Democratic Activism, and many more. She also has served as the editor of Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, and is currently sitting on the boards of several influential journals in political science and feminist studies. So,
Thank you.
thank you for coming.
When I set out this morning, it never occurred to me that Max Weber would be such a phenom in this panel discussion, but of course it makes a huge amount of sense, particularly in my own life. When I was in graduate school, in the height of behavioral revolution, so we're talking decades ago, we were taught that in the realm of facts, there could be knowledge, but in the realm of theory, values, anything normative, you got smush, you got feeling, you got metaphysics, something altogether terrible. So as I think about how do I even make sense of the kinds of projects I've done over the past 4 decades, I think what I have been, and David's presentation has just given me this little insight, what I've been trying to do is find a way of explaining that theoretical analysis is rational and that there are profound grounds within norms of deliberation for vindicating theoretical work. So what I want to do very briefly this morning is talk a little bit about how to move beyond the fact-value dichotomy, how to think about methodology in a different way, and also, I don't know how many of you are involved in the discipline of political science, but political science is now enthralled in a transparency regime. The DART standards, data access, and research transparency discourses have the potential to destroy lots of people's lives who happen to do normative analysis. So I'm going to use that as an example of why I think theoretical approaches are profoundly important. In his essay, Max Weber, Legitimation, Method, and the Politics of Theory, Sheldon Wolin advanced an insightful etymology of methodology. Arising from the conjunction of 3 Greek concepts, meta, hodos, and logos, Wolin suggested that methodology might best be understood as a shared quest for a path to truth, or alternatively, as the way a group legitimates knowledge claims. So one seems quite neutral, a path to truth, the other is a very different project, legitimation of the path chosen. The Greek roots make clear that methodologies involve philosophical questions about the nature of knowledge, as well as practical